And in tonight's episode of It's Your Time You're Wasting, we're looking at pointy-elbowed parents.
We're also interviewing everybody's favourite champion teacher, Doug Lemov.
Parents should have the right to choose the schools that they send their children to. If they don't have those choices, they're consigned to schools that are fundamentally inadequate and don't give their children what they deserve.
And the inevitable big changes to GCSEs.
And we'll also be reviewing children's return to school, whether they're doing what they're told, wearing masks, taking tests, and everything else.
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Time You're Wasting, and a bit like Susanna Reid, I think it is. Is it Susanna Reid? I seem to be on my own, having to present the show today.
I was going to storm off, but
you did. You've stormed off, and you've come back on.
Come back. I don't know. I'm hoping not to be sacked, Martin. Oh, what have we got today in this week's show? We've got. Well, we've just said what we've got.
Indeed, we have just said.
It's no mystery.
But let's talk.
It's been a busy week, hasn't it? It's been a busy week, and there's a lot been going
really
on.
Traumatizing. Clearly traumatizing.
And it's been particularly traumatizing for a particular breed of parents, hasn't it?
Yeah. So we'll start a bit with the pointy elbows, the worry of, and I think it's an article in the Guardian. We have Richard Sheriff, who's executive head teacher of Harrogate Grammar School and president of the ASCL, said he was worried that schools are being left exposed by the government's policy of replacing exams in England with grades awarded by teacher assessment. Sheriff said he feared that parents with pointy elbows would be more prepared to push for their children to receive better grades, meaning pupils with parents unable or unwilling to confront teachers were likely to be left even further behind.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? That I think that there's got to be something to do with the leadership of a school there, that maybe as head teacher he can mitigate against that somewhat.
Well, Jeff Barton then goes on to talk about this. He's saying that the head teachers union had warned the government there needed to be strict quality assurance mechanisms to take the pressure off teachers and allow them to justify their opinions. And we've seen examples, he said, where parents have been emailing individual teachers saying things such as, my daughter wants to be a doctor in the future and she needs to get a grade 9 in chemistry at GCSE. We have to protect teachers from all of this.
Yeah, and you do, and I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that goes on. And as to whether, let's imagine, that I've received an email from a pointy-elbowed parent asking for their daughter to get grade 9s in their subjects so they can go on and be doctors, and I refer that to my head teacher at Harrogate Grammar School and say, what do I do about this? And the head teacher says, ignore it. I will get in touch with them on your behalf and tell them that behaviour is not acceptable. So, I think it's on him a little bit to do that. I think where we've got a real potential problem is after this process, where we have the official position is that students are able to challenge the school as to the grades they were awarded, and that seems to be there's so much potential for that to go wrong, isn't there, and to become ugly.
The whole thing can go wrong. I'm interested in how the rich as well might sort of work their way around it in either private schools or indeed state schools. How about a new sports hall, for example? Or a new theatre, or do you need? Perhaps I could help get a new car park for the staff Mazda or whatever. I don't know.
The staff Mazda.
Only one car in this school, and it's a Mazda, and they all sit in it like the wacky races.
What school is this, Martin?
It's one that I've just come up with. It's the school of pointy elbows,
right,
in Pointy-Elbowshire.
Right.
But I mean, if you're a pointy-elbow parent who's got a certain amount of sway, perhaps you're on the governing body, for example, or you're a teacher in the school or a a teacher in another school. I mean, influence works in different ways.
It does. And as I'm sure you know, Martin, if you work at a school and you've got a child in an exam year, you have to declare that. That is something that needs to be put above board. And so there are mechanisms for trying to minimise this kind of pressure. It's not. I mean, sure, there will no doubt there will be thousands of parents contacting schools on their children's behalf, and I'm sure the same was true last year as well. And why wouldn't you, as a parent, do that? As to whether schools are going to be, how they're going to be responding to that, is a different matter. I would imagine, I would hope that a head teacher would have a position on that and would communicate very clearly with parents about what is and is not acceptable, and there to be a very, very clear ruling on that. And then
beyond the school, it should be a national ruling.
Well, maybe it should be.
These things.
I think that's probably a waste of time trying to sort of legislate that parents aren't allowed to contact schools. That's not what
No. But about exam grades and make that very clear, because I mean, the other thing is how many teachers are starting to get, I don't know, an apple every week or a bottle of wine every morning. Or whatever it has to be, the gifts that might come in. This might sort of smooth the way. I mean, all sorts of things could happen that parents might, the pushy-elbowed ones, whoever they might be thinking this could make a difference to the final grade.
Yeah, I think that's an issue, and it will. There's an inevitability to it. But as I said, I think where we've got the real problem, apart from the echo that we're detecting as we're speaking, the real problem is that after the fact, the appeals process. That's where I think it's going to be grim, because if a parent or a student, but if parents and students feel hard done by in some way, that they weren't given the grade 9, it is inevitably, that's where the sharpness of your elbows is going to come into its own.
And perhaps later, when we pick up to general changes in the future about GCSEs, we could discuss this a bit further. But it's interesting how a continual assessment way of dealing with GCSEs, whether it works so well in a high stakes exam system where quite a lot rests on the grades you get.
Yeah, absolutely. I think whether the high stakes. This is one of the other things that everyone's agreed that the high stakes nature of exams is a bad thing. I don't think there's anyone saying high stakes exams brilliant, we should have those more often. But I think the lived experience of many students in year 11 and year 13 this year is going to be even more stressful, because every move they make is up for scrutiny. That they're being told, certainly in some schools, they're being told, that everything that they do in lessons from here on until the deadline can potentially affect their grade. That's got to be stressful, hasn't it?
I think indeed it does. Should we talk about that here, or should we talk about it later with the? What do you want to do?
Well, I wanted to talk about it now, but
I don't mind. I don't mind. You can talk about it now if you wish. No, the big changes at GCSE that might then come along.
Oh no, we don't. Let's not talk about that now. Let's just talk about stress.
Let's talk about just the stress. Okay, what in terms of kids going back, if they're being told suddenly that everything they do and potentially have done online the last few weeks, it's certainly not something that's going to make them rest easily in their bed, shall we say?
No, definitely not. And I think there's a sense for perhaps that some children who for whatever reason struggled to engage during this second lockdown, that I think that for many of those children, there is a sense that they've blown it, that somehow not contributing and participating with as fully as they might in that period might well contribute to them getting lower grades. And these are some of the conversations that are desperately, frantically trying to be resolved in schools as we speak. That schools are still waiting for clear guidance from exam boards about standardization, moderation, what on earth's going to happen there, that they're hoping for more guidance. Whether it will come or not is unclear, I think.
And also for the kid, blah, 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 Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, whatever, they don't like me. So they're not going to give me a good grade. That's it. I might as well give up with that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and I guess the reverse, where children feel, I feel like I've banked some good stuff for biology or for French, so I can switch off there and concentrate on the subjects where I've still got something to prove, and that's possibly not very good either.
Yeah. So it's a difficult time for all, and it's a difficult time for the teachers having to justify grades that they perhaps are giving or thinking of giving, and looking for the evidence and whether the evidence is strong enough. So it seems like it could be an endless nightmare of just collecting
collecting
evidence
continual assessments. Grim.
And moderation going on left, right, and centre for little reward or need. Perhaps.
If you could sit down and with the debacle that was last year, if everyone involved had been asked to sit down and devise a solution that was much worse, they couldn't have done any better than what we've got this year. So hats off to everyone involved in that. Good job.
Now, subscribe to the channel and you'll see lots of chats like this coming up in the future. And also you can delve into chats like this in the past, but also interviews that we've done with various people over time. And again, will come up in the future. And David, you've done an interview this week.
Yeah, I interviewed Doug Lemov of Teach Like a Champion fame. And he... there's a long interview that's going to come out later in the week, but we've got I think 11 minutes of pure Lemov for your delight and edification coming up now. Doug, let me ask you a little bit about Uncommon Schools. You said it started around about 20 years ago, and people in the UK might not be completely familiar with charter schools and how they operate.
Sure.
Although I think often the parallel is drawn between free schools in England. Is there a difference?
Well, so charter schools they're public schools, but they're autonomous, so they operate outside of the sort of district infrastructure that we have here. The way that schools operate is much more decentralized in the U.S., and so the federal government has actually very little to do with public education. It's mostly run by the states, and they delegate decision-making authority to districts, and they tend to be fairly bureaucratic and not especially flexible. And so the idea behind charter schools was we'll give schools building level autonomy and hold them accountable for their results and see what they can do. And so they tend to be much more flexible and more autonomous. Interestingly, they run the gamut in philosophical styles and approaches. I think among the most successful have been a group of schools like Uncommon Schools and KIPP and Achievement First that run in kind of a similar way. But you can find almost anything under the sun. As a charter school, really, it's just an operating philosophy.
Right. And I think one of the things that sort of fascinates me about how charter schools run in some cities is that they actually occupy the same buildings as public schools. How does that work?
Yeah, that tends to happen a lot in New York City. And I mean, so I think it's a market-based reform charter school. So the idea is in the United States, money goes to the district, the school district. So let's say there's Centerville City School District. They get a pot of money from the state to educate all the students in the district. When there's a charter school in the district, the money that would go to educate those students follows the students to the school. And so the district would forward a per pupil portion of the revenue to the school. The school gets to operate. And the idea is that puts pressure on the district to be better also, to keep their students. One of the challenges is that that per pupil revenue does not take into account real estate costs and building costs. So it's the operating revenue that's divided up when per pupil revenues are allocated. And so that's actually about 70% of what schools actually spend to educate students, because they also buy and own buildings. And so in different places, there have been different efforts to sort of mitigate that issue. In New York City, the city decided that district schools with extra space had to lease back extra space, or could lease back extra space to charter schools, so that they couldn't just sort of sit on empty buildings while charter schools were out there trying to lease incredibly expensive space in New York City. And so you often find there would be schools with with half the building unused, and so they have the result has been that those schools lease half of their space to charter schools. So oftentimes there's a district school and a charter school in the same building. And hopefully, in the best case, schools often find a way to work together and be collegial and positive and share ideas. And I think there are also some cases where the relations are not quite so positive. But for the most part, educators tend to get down to the business of educating kids pretty quickly and get beyond the tensions and conflicts relatively quickly.
Yeah. It's interesting that I hadn't realised until this summer. I read a book by Thomas Sowell called Charter Schools and Their Enemies. I was quite surprised the level of controversy there is that surrounds charter school education. Is that something that you think your network comes up against much?
Yes, quite a bit.
Because he was particularly talking about some of the controversy around Achievement First, who's got quite a robust and confrontational leader in Markowitz, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's actually Success Academies.
Success Academy. Sorry, yeah.
Yes. Look, I think she runs great schools, and Eva Moskowitz, and her results have been incredible. And I think she's not afraid. She's not afraid to speak what she thinks is the truth, and there have been conflicts for her, and I think she would say that every battle she fights is to make sure she can run the school she can for kids. So I think many of us would tend to take for better or for worse, would probably take a more conciliatory approach and try to, I think there's rational dissent and there's irrational dissent. And I think people who have legitimate questions and want to make sure that it's done right, those are good questions. And then I think there are people who are always going to fight what charter schools do. And to me, they're deeply important for empowering parents. Parents should have the right to choose the schools that they send their children to, especially if they don't have those choices, they're consigned to schools that are fundamentally inadequate and don't give their children what they deserve. And so, yes, there are tensions, and there are positive tensions and there are negative tensions. And for the most part, I think most of us just get on with the work of educating students and tend to ignore the shouting as much as we can.
Yeah, fair enough. In some people's minds, I think the argument sometimes seems to go along the lines of, why should children from those disadvantaged backgrounds, why should they have stricter expectations for behaviour? Why should they be treated in different ways from middle-class kids, from white kids in different neighbourhoods? And I think one of the questions I wanted to put to you is that, do you think the sort of education that a network like Uncommon offers is appropriate for all children? Should all children get that kind of experience, in your view?
I think everyone should have the right to it.
Yeah.
People ask me all the time, would you want your own children, educated in the Teach Like a Champion way? And the answer is yes, emphatically. And not only that, but I've worked with the schools that my children go to try and give them what I perceive to be a more engaging, more rigorous, more demanding school experience that is worthy of the children that they are. And I think that every parent has the right to ask for that for their children. I don't perceive Teach Like a Champion to be a book about. I think it applies to schools and classrooms. To me, the most interesting application is like the place of the greatest need is what happens to students who are in areas where schools are insufficient to serve them, and who often bear the legacy of having been for years in schools that have served them poorly. And I'm sorry, but in that case, there is some urgency involved. And there is no time to waste, because students are years behind, and if they want to have the chance to achieve their dreams and participate in meritocracy and opportunity, schools are going to have to do better, and they're going to have to catch them up, and they're going to have to, they're going to have to gain several, they're going to have to catch up in reading and math and science, and there's a lot of work to be done. So I think, to me, children have the right to that, and I think that it can be done lovingly and supportively. And my kids are older now. My daughter is in her last year before she goes to university, and if you want to make her angry, waste her time in class. Honestly, yeah. The teachers that she has who have high expectations for her, who push her hard, who pay attention to what she's doing every minute in class, and who give her hard and challenging work, and don't waste a second, she loves those teachers. So yes, I think it's about good teaching, and I think that teachers always, it's a set of tools that are about good teaching, and great teachers always take tools and adapt them to the situation that they're in. But I think students deserve it.
I mean, one of the things that it occurs to me is that for children who from advantaged backgrounds, it almost doesn't matter that much what goes on in schools, because they'll be caught by their families, by their wider networks. But for children that don't have those assets, school might be certainly their best hope at having choice. And if schools aren't doing that, then they're really letting them down.
I think that's perfectly put. Better put than I put it. But absolutely true. There's a significant number of schools in this country that no parent would willingly send their child to, and children, and real kids and real families are forced to consign their children to those schools every day, and it is fundamentally unjust, and it is fundamentally unfair. That makes me angry.
Yeah. No, and I think that one of the things that I think sometimes people haven't thought through necessarily is that if you're wealthy, you've always got choice. You can you choose to move house to a district where has a school you want your children to attend, or maybe you can choose to pay for your children's education. But if you don't have money, you don't have those choices. And so if there is just a default, you have to go to this school, no matter how dysfunctional it is, and only poor people are faced with that lack of choice, then there's something really iniquitous about it, isn't there?
I mean, that's one of the biggest dissents against charter schools, which is people who have the luxury of place and the luxury of caste say, we don't really need school choice, do we? Schools work fine the way they are. And that's because they've already exercised school choice. They've moved to a place where they have excellent school options. No one who has choice does not use it. Everyone would put their child into the best school that they possibly could. The question is, who gets choice, and is it fair that it's something given to families of prosperity, and that the rest of families have to take what's given to them, even when it's inadequate. So I guarantee you that anyone who says choice is unnecessary has choice.
Right, fair point. Okay, we can certainly put that to the test. If anyone feels that they don't have, that choice is unnecessary, and feels that they don't have choice, get in touch, and we'll happily discuss that with you. Well, there we are. So Doug, they're talking, amongst other things, about school choice and how everyone should have it. Martin, should everyone have their choice of schools? Should they get some choice?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's got a lot of resonance over here, because ostensibly we have a system in some areas that are meant to reflect somewhat parental choice around schools, whether it be primary or secondary. And if you live in a rural area, I think the choice is more likely to be which school is within 5 miles or 5 whatever in order to get into. But in urban areas, you've got about 7, 8, 9 schools ostensibly on your doorstep that you try to say which is the best school for my child, and try and get your child in. And I think we had, for instance, 6 choices for secondary, 6 choices for primary. For primary, our first choice was ignored, our second choice was ignored, our third choice was ignored, fourth choice, I think we got the 5th choice school. So choice would have to reflect parental choice, in my opinion, if it's going to be choice rather than preference, which I think is what they call it over here. So choice. Do we have our choice? Well, everyone wants to go to that great school, perhaps, which means that great school has got to have places for everyone who wants to go to it. So the only way you can make choice work in a system is to have overcapacity. So you have to put a huge amount of money into the school system to ensure that every kid whose parents want them to go or kid wants to go to that school gets into that school. So spend, spend, spend.
Yeah. So choice is just an illusion.
It's for those who, I think most people get their first choice. I think it was something like 60% of parents got the first choice in the recent round of secondary school applications, which shows that most do, but a significant number don't.
Yeah.
Now, again, whether it's because it's the local school and the easiest one to get to when I'm on my way to work or whatever, that could be the reasons behind it. But it's a strange thing because at the same time, you're saying that why have differences in schools where you'd also want to make choice worthwhile. So this school is, I don't know, a forest school. This school is a very much an old-fashioned traditionalist school. This is highly progressive. It's got to be a marketplace of completely different philosophies and ideas, which means there shouldn't be a national curriculum. There shouldn't be national exams. There should be, like a true marketplace, Tesco's and Morrison's or whatever it happens to be. Which store do I want to go to? Which school do I want to go to? So to have complete choice in the system, you need completely different schools to make it worthwhile, rather than this one's rubbish and that one's good.
Right. So it's still the case. We've got. I don't know if you're hearing me echoing, but I'm still.
No, you're fine.
I'm fine. Okay. So I think it's fair to say that that certain people or certain sections of society have much more choice than others. That would be true, wouldn't it?
It's those pointy-elbowed parents, of course, who might be more interested in making choices and making sure that their child gets into whichever school they want through nefarious means or fair means. But also rich people can make more choices generally than poor people.
Well,
About
exactly.
which school to go to, because they can pay for the education perhaps they want.
Well, they
They
can
want
pay
their
for their
kid to go to
education.
Wellington or Eton or something.
But even there's obviously a huge part of the housing market is about people choosing their home based on the closeness of good schools. So that's something that is just become a normal part of pointy-elbowed life, really.
Yeah, it's the school, the house prices around good primary schools, I think, are something. And again, this is off the top of my head, so I don't know if it's still true, but something like 8,000 to 15,000 more than similar houses just outside the catchment area for certain schools.
Yeah.
So,
I didn't talk about this with Doug, but one of the things that is one of the ways that places are awarded in many charter school networks in the US and in some schools in the UK is by lottery. And so obviously you put your name down and the fortunate few are given a place. Is that a fairer way to do things?
Well, look, it's a fairer way, but everyone who's ever sort of got into a lottery for something slightly less serious than the education of your child has a certain amount of disappointment when they don't get the bottle of pomade at the end of it, or whatever happens to be the top prize in your school fate. So there's
it's still smart, doesn't it, Martin?
Well, no, it if your child doesn't get into the school because of a lottery ticket, and I take it that there's fewer lottery tickets that get in and more that don't, perhaps, then I think that how you explain that the school is so good that not many people can get in and you've just happened to win this place, it's very good to the child who gets in. To the child who doesn't get in, to them it's to say, well, you're going to the second-rate school now because you didn't win life's lottery. And it just seems to me slightly
I guess
unfair.
the alternative, though, Martin, is
Imagine it for hospitals. Imagine you've got a heart complaint, so you go for the lottery for the good hospital, for the heart hospital. Well, would you actually say, okay, I'll go for the lottery? I don't mind. I don't mind going to the third-rate
I guess the alternative, though, is that those people who have already won life's lottery are put automatically at the front of every queue for hospitals and schools and everything else we can think of. And here's a potential way of redressing balance and having it completely up to the spin of the wheel of fate, and the privileged and the unprivileged have as much chance as either of getting what they want. Is that preferable?
I completely understand the logic of it from that perspective, which is sort of a managerial perspective, but talking about it from a parental and a person perspective, a pupil perspective, of saying that there are loads of crap schools around here and a couple of good ones. Let's try and get you into the couple of good ones. Oh, well, there's the crap ones you're going to. The problem is having too many crap schools and not enough good ones. And so that takes investment throughout the system and
Yeah, of
actually
course.
creating better schools. So life isn't a lottery from day one.
Of course, and the situation, obviously, we should make clear, in the US is different. The way in which the public schools and charter schools are held to account is different. The regulations governing them are different, and we don't. I mean, of course, we have a private sector in the UK which has slightly different rules, but the corollary that's often drawn between charter schools and free schools and academies is not in anywhere near as distinct here as it is there. So the idea of investment across the system is an important one, because obviously the default position of yesteryear was that schools were part of local authorities, and it was the local authorities' job to invest in the schools in their area. And now we have schools who are invested in by multi-academy trusts, and some trusts may invest more wisely than others. Schools outside of the trust umbrella maybe feel the cold.
Yeah, and again with multi-academy trusts, if you've got a Harris school, an ARC school within your realm, and you choose between, because you like the Harris brand or the ARC brand more, whatever it happens to be, I mean, and all schools were like that, then again that might have some sort of way of working in a market economy. But
But not
when it is
in
you
the
can
rural
only
area.
get into one, whether it's you've got to like carpets, off you go to Harris, that's your only choice because that's the school you've been allotted, then it's not really a choice system. It's not about those sorts of things. And it then tends to fall apart as saying, well, I don't actually like Harris schools. I don't like their ethos. Why is my kid having to go to a school that deals that way with them? And that's where a complete choice would be better, because perhaps I prefer something that's more progressive, more forest school oriented, less worried about exam results and things like that. And my child could thrive in that environment and unlikely to in the Harris environment, for example.
Well, we're not going to resolve this here, are we? Sadly, but on that though, there are potentially big changes afoot.
Yeah, well, this goes down to what we were sort of talking about, alluding to earlier with the GCSEs and perhaps A levels as well. What to do after this year's debacle, perhaps with the exams and how they're going to be graded and everything else. There are a number of people who are pushing to against the open door, if you like. For some now it's creaking opening more and more towards different forms of assessment, certainly at GCSE, and that's where the big changes have been sort of argued for. And Peter Hyman of School 21 fame and his group Rethinking Assessment have been presenting some ideas around the sorts of things he would like. And he talks about strengths-based assessment systems. You try saying that.
Have you brushed your teeth?
that certain businesses are bringing in, rather than worrying so much about exam results. They're starting looking at different, well, the old word perhaps instead of strengths was competencies or skills. And he's listed in an article he did for the Observer last Sunday agility, initiative, curiosity, problem solving, collaboration, and emotional intelligence. It's always about lists of words. Don't forget these things.
Yeah. So that's what we need. We need to spend time. I mean, are these going to be very low stakes assessments?
Well, this is it.
We're going to test out your agility. You've not done very well. Don't worry about it. We're just going to say you tried hard and you're a lovely person.
Well, let's say it's as these are business based, then I take it this is whether you get into the job of your choice, for example,
Quite high stakes.
and perhaps if the businesses are setting these certain tests, then they are quite high stakes. Yeah, absolutely, because you might not get that job at, let's say, Barclays.
Let's say it's Barclays. So I've applied to Barclays and they say, well, I can see that you've got really, really high grades in your GCSEs, but I'm not interested in any of those. Instead, I want to do a strength-based assessment on your agility and on your emotional intelligence. And that is what's going to get you the job. So it doesn't matter that you can't write or add up, but you've got really strong emotional intelligence. Welcome to Barclays. Is that naive? I mean, obviously, I'm caricaturing the process there, but is that naive to think that's that?
I think the agility thing's quite interesting for working at Barclays. I'd like to see, I think it's mentally agile rather than physically agile. Perhaps I don't know.
It is.
And why we're throwing Barclays into this, I do apologise.
Well,
should they be watching? Well, who knows? Who knows? There is certainly something I know that Barclays in particular have tried in the past, which is to move away from so much worry about exam results, particularly for certain communities and for people based around class and race and gender and various other things, to say that there are other aspects we need, and therefore we're taking on people we wouldn't ordinarily take on, and using certain things within the firm structure and their own professional education environment within the business to help people become more able to work in a Barclays environment, which actually seems to me something which is quite good. I mean, why should a GCSE in French and or in let's say PE or whatever, or drama, for goodness sake, make you someone who's particularly suited to working in a certain environment in a certain city company like Barclays be something that should be there? That's not necessarily what schools are best addressed to do.
No, it isn't. It isn't, and that's an important point. But I think that in this brave new world that Hyman talks about, with employers setting their own strength-based assessments, looking for these 20th century strengths, 21st century, 20. I can't remember what century it is. I'm afraid. Do not employers always also want to have information about minimum standards in certain disciplines?
Well, it's also where we got to. We talked about this last week a bit, and we've talked about these things before. So if people want to have a look back through these discussions, then there's quite a lot of rich discussions there, including with various other people about this. What do we do GCSEs for, and what to do about the 40% or so who don't get the grades, who don't succeed in the sort of academic world, and what about more vocational based courses, etc., etc., etc. So I think there are things that will be changing through the system to try and address these huge iniquities and issues that we've got, and not writing someone off because they've got a grade 4 rather than a grade 5 in maths or English. I think it is quite important. But are schools the best place for that, and whether businesses should take more of a say in the sorts of skills and training of people towards those skills, I think is something which can be part of the discussion. And certainly if we're talking about lifelong learning and learning in the workplace and all those things that people have been trotting out for years, then I think that is something that should be changed and should have investment in it. But whether schools are the best place to get someone to be more agile so they can get a job in goes, I'm not sure.
No, absolutely. So Hyman's point there, that employers are no longer satisfied with 2 1s or exam grades, and that they should do their own assessments. That's absolutely right and proper. That's what we should be encouraging, is employers to do their own assessments and not just going with exam grades. But that doesn't tell us anything particularly about what schools should be doing. On the
And can we separate the idea of education and training a bit? Because education is a wider thing than just preparing you for the workplace. Training
absolutely
can be more specifically geared towards certain jobs, certain careers, certain ways of working, and also retraining as well for when you change jobs. And putting that within the system would make it a lot better.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the big questions on the Rethinking Assessment site, and these are the big questions, the big issues, so that many people find our exam system is really stressful, not a true reflection of what they're good at. I do still find it really fascinating that in the last 2 years has presented a real opportunity for people to come forward and go, here's an alternative. We've desperately needed an alternative with exams being cancelled. And nobody has made any seemingly coherent, interesting, sensible suggestion. So there is an issue. Exams are stressful. They're not great. We don't like them. But what's the alternative? Many employers complain that exams don't provide them with good enough clues. I frankly, I just find it really hard to care about what employers want. They should meet those needs themselves. The schools, I do not believe that schools should be the at the beck and call of employers and providing what employers want.
Absolutely. I mean, it's obviously part of a connection between schools and careers is something which has been there for quite some time, with careers themselves and saying here's the jobs fair, here's the university fair, and all this sort of stuff.
We want children's education to provide them with some choice as to what careers they might want to or are able to enter, and that's all to the good. But doing it for the benefit of employers just seems to fit very awkwardly for me.
Yeah, but I suppose when it goes back to the grammar school and the technical school and then the secondary modern, were very geared towards very different lifestyles, shall we say, based on, if you went to the secondary modern, the jobs available to you were likely to be less and different to the jobs available in the other two parts of the tripartite system that never really happened in this country. But if you go to Germany, there are schools which are more pointed towards technical education, engineering and stuff like that. But of course, they've got an economy that actually helps feed this. In other words, they've got factories and places like that, whereas our industrial sector since the 1970s has reduced hugely. So the jobs are very different that we're even contemplating people.
Well, they also have a system of academic selection much younger than we do in most parts of the country over here, and that leads to greater social disparities, and that children from poorer backgrounds tend to find themselves disproportionately in the technical streams, whether they might actually want to be there or not.
It's interesting. I was talking to someone yesterday, I think it was, about fictive cultures, about how certain elements of society sort of it's the stories they tell their kids, shall we say. So a middle class kid would be more likely to hear the expectation is for them to go to university, whereas someone who's perhaps from an Asian background, and this is what the person said to me, was more likely to be a doctor or a lawyer, to have that sort of ingrained into them or whatever. So different fictive cultures tell different stories to a child. Now, whether they then follow those things through or not is a different matter. But there has to be a certain amount of the school trying to work against fictive cultures, if you like, and rather than sort of letting people be the author of their parents' story, using a quote from Peter Heimer's article, if you really want children to be authors of their own stories, you have to educate them widely in a so they can actually sort of work out what they want to do, and not whether they find themselves they can be particularly agile, a problem solver and a collaborator, but know about lots of different ways of living in the world and making sense of the world.
Yeah, I mean, and it sort of asks another question about what are schools for? Are they to help children become their own authors, whatever that means, or or which is it's a very broad, ill-defined aim, which is inevitably going to lead to people doing a range of rather eccentric things, or do we narrow the scope of what schools are doing to say actually what we're doing is we're educating you in a range of subjects that we think are important for you to have a broad grounding in, and I always want to drag schools back to that, because it's doable,
and it's about quality of life and in the whole rather than just one area, but it can certainly help. And obviously what's classically called the 3 R's can help in most, if not all, careers.
Yeah. Well, there we are. Okay, so reading, writing, arithmetic, we've all gone green. I don't know, have we all gone green?
I haven't gone green. Perhaps you're getting angry.
It might be that. So
and finally we get to,
before we move on from big changes, some of the other big changes that Gavin Williamson was discussing were changes about the school day and the school calendar. Should we reduce the length of summer holidays? Should the school day be significantly longer? I think part of the narrative here is that the effects of the pandemic and whether children have been fallen so far behind that there's a real need for change to happen here. Should we make these kinds of changes?
I think, and these are the sorts of changes that are going to be made in a hurry and never necessarily the best things to make for long-term change. I think they're talking about 5-term years and saying, this goes back to the Victorian times and having to bring in the harvest and all this sort of stuff, or whatever the argument is.
True, by the way, that's a myth.
Yeah, there you go. And the other thing about the length of the school day and all that, which apparently is getting shorter at the moment. I didn't know that was right or wrong, but it's getting earlier. It's finishing earlier than it used to. So he wants people to be in 9 to 5 or earlier to 5 or 6 or 7, I suppose, and then get rid of the school holidays. And you probably have to pay teachers more as well, of course, if you shorten the amount of holiday. But certainly to change the length of the summer one is always the big one, because people forget what they've learned because they were on holiday for so long.
Yeah.
And teachers forget what they've taught. What's going on?
Yeah, no, all of that. And I think the other, the thing that I've always felt working in schools, Martin, is that the first term, the September to Christmas slog is grueling, and anything that can do something, anything that can mitigate against that.
I think, I do actually strongly recommend the 2-week October half-term break. I think that's something you could take it. And here's me arguing against myself. You could take a week off the summer holiday and bung it in October.
Well, if you want to protect your 6-week holiday and you think that's more important than having 2 weeks in October, let us know, and we'll scoff at you.
So how about masks in schools? And
I think it's been an incredibly stressful week for people working in schools, and I've seen some of that firsthand myself in schools. That the pressure to get people tested and to deal with the potential for false positives is tough, but schools have stepped up to the plate and are doing that well. That there is inevitably proportions of students who are refusing to take tests, and schools are not really in a position to do anything about that. So that's tricky. I think in some schools, that what they've struggled with is getting permission slips back from parents, and say,
well, yes, it's not surprising. This permission slip, so to speak, for each test, the one that's done on the NHS website, is quite it's not just asking for the test and a bit of info. It's then doing a whole thing about ethnicity, trying to work out. It's even asking about my daughter, who's in year 10, asking what job she does, what business she works in, which is completely obviously nothing to do with what she's doing, because she's a school child. She doesn't work in all these businesses you're trying to say she might be able to work in, and it takes ages.
Yeah.
If you haven't got the access to the internet.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And I think that for certainly in some communities, the idea that if your child gets a positive result, a false positive seeming to be not hugely unlikely, then you're going to have to be isolating for 10 days. And the blow to your income, if you're in a precarious position, might mean that results in real hardship. And so it kind of makes sense that some parents, it seems like a huge gamble to take to allow those tests to go ahead, even if you might be happy in normal circumstances.
And you're not allowed a PCR test as a second opinion for the ones done in school, but you are allowed them for the ones done at home.
Bizarre. Makes difficult to make sense of that, isn't it? So that's causing difficulties. And then we talked about this a few weeks ago, the fact that schools really don't have the power to insist that students wear masks, and so some students don't want to do it.
And there's a head teacher who got into problems. Talking of problems.
Talking of problems.
There we go. There's a head teacher who got into trouble this week for saying that he would put the students who refused to wear masks in separate, they could all breathe over each other.
What's wrong with that, Martin?
Well, I don't think there is much wrong with that, actually. I mean, if it is a public health issue, and we are saying that masks are seriously needed, and then some schools are letting kids without masks mingle with kids with masks, or vice versa, or whatever, then why wear masks at all? You know, if you're saying it's not an issue, I mean, is it an issue? Is it not an issue? If it is an issue, then you've got to do something about it, because if it's a public health issue, you're not wearing a mask, it's an issue.
And we have the absurdity of schools being able to, compel students to wear blazers or a particular colour sock, but them being powerless about face covering. So that seems inconsistent, doesn't it?
Yeah, and of course there are issues with breathe, for some who have medical needs, but then that is carried in various different ways by bringing a note in or whatever from the doctor or whatever. It could be known about that this kid has asthma or whatever over a period of time. But even then you say, well, it's still a health issue. If this is as serious as they're saying it is, I don't wish to cast aspersions, but the jury is certainly in different places where it comes to mask use. And some people find it more controversial than others, shall we say. The small difference, they're saying overall, it's a small difference in schools.
Small difference, but it could be life or death. And I think that's I was listening to the Today programme this morning. They were interviewing some students as part of that. And the balance of opinion seemed to be that students, and this is borne out by the students I've spoken to, is that most of them are really pleased to be back at school, but anxious, fearful. And no wonder the fact that their schools have been turned into test centres, and that there's now a requirement to wear masks because of the risk of spreading disease. It's a febrile environment. I think schools and teachers are doing their utmost to make children's return to school welcoming and positive, but it's a tough one.
It is a tough one, but I'm sure.
How's your daughter doing? Is she
well, she's back at school.
Yeah.
And getting back at school is the best in the longer term for everyone, because sitting at home staring at screens all day long is certainly not.
My two definitely on balance, happy to be back. But that sort of anxiety bubbling along beneath it all is very much a feature.
I was working with a school this morning, and they were actually saying for some of their pupils, most of them glad to be back, getting into work, etc., but some of them who actually flourished by being at home.
That's true.
Finding it are refusing to go back because of, and we're talking about very anxious school refusing pupils who've had a history of this. But actually, and I was sort of contemplating, well, whether Oak National Academy or someone like that could become a place where kids who refuse do have a online school alternative, perhaps as an alternative provision for.
I think that's a really positive idea, and I think that I would really hope that, because there's what what goes on in the name of homeschooling can be potentially fantastic, but it can be god awful as well. And having something like Oak in place is probably much better than not having it. And
Yeah, it could be an interesting option for people, and
Yeah.
rather than the school having to try and provide it, having a national way of doing this, not for people who want to do homeschooling because they reject the system, but for kids who naturally are finding it very stressful, who are highly anxious, school refusing for whatever reason, then perhaps there is a role for Oak National and or another agency to perhaps provide education.
Well, seeing as all of this work has been done and all of this money has been spent, that seems very wise. As always, Martin, you're very, very wise. It comes with your seniority, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's aged, yes.
Yeah. Well, on that
bombshell.
Yeah, on that lovely closing image of Martin's snowy wisdom. That's it for another week. That's all we've got. That's all we've got the will to talk about, I think. Thanks ever so much for bearing with us yet again. And sorry.
See you next time.
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed.